Well, folks, let's talk about the cards that have been murdered by the Deadmines. In other words, cards that have been eclipsed in one way or another, where there's just a seemingly vastly superior version in the latest set here for the Deadmines, kind of like Arcane Overflow and Flame Lance. You'll see here behind me. Now, I'm not making like crazy statements about power creep. Some of these are going to be totally fine cards. They're not inherently bad for the game or anything. I'll let you argue about power creep and value statements down there in the comments. I'm just pointing out these differences for better or for worse. And, you know, normally I do this for every expansion. Like I've been doing this since Frozen Throne, I think, where I'll take 8-10 cards from an expansion and showcase the really distinct and obvious examples of cards that are just way better. But the Deadmines had so many that I was actually able to put together a list just from the mini set itself. Out of 35 cards, there's still so many that look just drastically better than old cards. So kicking it off, let's talk about the Arcane Overflow and Flame Lance here. This is probably the most egregious and obvious example because they're both 5-mana spells. They both deal exactly 8 damage. They're from the same class. But Arcane Overflow has this enormous upside because anytime you kill something smaller than 8 health, you're going to get this minion summoned essentially for free compared to Flame Lance. They both, of course, have spell schools. I mean, sure, if you really need some fire spells, maybe you'd pick a Flame Lance. But 99.9% of the time, Arcane Overflow just has way more upside because you're going to sometimes get like free 4/4, free 5/5 out of this sucker, which makes it much swingier. A card like Flame Lance just absolutely would never see play in modern Hearthstone. Arcane Overflow still not actually seeing play in modern Hearthstone. So this is one of those, I don't know if this is an unhealthy example of power creep or anything. I think it's just a card that's trying to keep up with modern day and had to make some pretty big improvements to do that, and is still not really overpowered or too crazy or anything. It feels like a completely healthy and fine card, despite how it's just way better. Moving on here to Blackwater Cutlass, which is murdered Bloodclaw, the old card for Paladin. You might remember this one. It came out and it was like kind of trying to set up heal Paladin stuff back in the Rosticon era. So it's like you need to take damage in order to heal yourself, get these like heal synergy cards. I actually thought Bloodclaw was going to be an insane card because back then a 1-mana 2/2 weapon seemed like a big deal. Despite this downside, which could kind of masquerade as an upside, of course, depending on the deck list, but it didn't take off. It didn't work super well, like most things in Rosticons. And here we have Blackwater Cutlass showing up now. And of course, this is a different class, but you know, class cards should be roughly similar strengths. And for Rogue, it's 1-mana 2/2 weapon. There's no downside here. In fact, there are these crazy upsides because this card is tradable, which means if you don't need a cheap weapon, toss this back in the deck. You get some card draw out of this as a bonus. On top of that, when you trade it, you get this spell discount as well, which basically makes it free to trade the Blackwater Cutlass. So you get all the upsides of this like overstated weapon for 1 mana, although maybe this isn't overstated anymore, but certainly seemed to be in the old days. And then you've got this awesome bonus that can set up combos and do shenanigans. And of course, Blackwater Cutlass is getting played because it's an insanely strong card. So Garrote Rogues have been running this one as another way to cycle and draw stuff and discount the cards they care about. So really good card. Bloodclaw was not a really good card. I'm not sure Blackwater Cutlass is OP. Just really strong. I think it probably feels okay, but again, just goes to show you how much the game has changed and evolved over the last few years, because Blackwater Cutlass is drastically better and still not OP. All right, so moving on here to Mr. Smite and Tundra Rhino. These cards are actually shockingly similar. They both give a minion type charge. Rhino, of course, beast. Smite is pirates. And Rhino is a pretty solid card. It's popped into various hunter lists throughout the years. It's just a good way to get some extra damage through and present this really scary threat on board. Your opponent just has to resolve this thing lest they get blown up. And Mr. Smite evolves on that by getting some extra damage. He's a 6/5, so way more threatening in his own right. Now, he does cost an extra mana point here, which is a downside, but he's also a neutral card, which are typically a little bit weaker than class cards. Class cards often get a bonus for that specificity and limitation that they're only available in one class, whereas neutral cards everybody can play, so you have to keep balance in check a little more. That said, Mr. Smite, of course, is very, very good, being played far more currently than Tundra Rhino ever would have back in the day, most prominently in Pirate Warrior, still showing up in a few things here and there. I don't actually think Mr. Smite is crazy OP like a lot of people out there. I think he's just a really good, solid card. You know, the game in general has crept up quite a bit in power, so, you know, it's all about context and fit within given metas, but I don't think Mr. Smite takes this too far, frankly. I think he's right on the border for acceptable power increase here. All right, so this one's kind of wild to take a look at. I thought this is really interesting. Cookie the Cook versus Deadly Fork. Now, these are both food themed in some way or another, which I thought was pretty cool. But man, is Cookie the Cook like 1,000 times better than Deadly Fork here from the Karazhan days. This is a very old card, of course. And I mean, the first thing that jumps out, of course, Cookie is a legendary. Generally, legendaries are going to be a little better than other cards. Whether they should be or not is a pretty big conversation. So yes, I wouldn't expect Cookie to be worse than Deadly Fork. Also, that is now a, like, I don't even know, 4 or 5 year old card or something. So it's had a long time to gain in power level, but it's still drastically different because Cookie, same cost and stats here of Deadly Fork, swapped up, of course, but same numbers. But Cookie has lifesteal, so this just huge upside on a base keyword. His Death Rattle is equipping the weapon, okay? And the weapon, again, is the same total stats of the weapon for Deadly Fork. And the weapon has lifesteal, so the weapon has this this upside as well. Deadly Fork, it just adds the weapon to your hand. And you have to replay the weapon. And I think the weapon's 3 mana, so that's a 6 mana total commitment for a worse weapon, a worse base minion. It's just crazy, right? And again, Cookie the Cook is not OP. Cookie the Cook is totally fine in modern day Hearthstone, and he just advances on Deadly Fork in like 3 or 4 distinct ways. So he also has a minion type upside as well. So yes, he's a legendary, but this is still far too big of a climb in power that a legendary would normally warrant. This just shows you how far the game has changed in 5 years. And again, I don't think this is necessarily unhealthy for current Hearthstone. It just showcases the big differences. So before we move on, I'd like to talk about our sponsor for this video, Keeps. That's right, 2/3 of guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35. I don't know that I love those odds, but the good news is with Keeps, you don't have to go visit a doctor. You can talk to one online. They'll send the prescription straight to you, which means you can keep grinding some duels runs without losing a lot of time, making life easy and convenient. So if you're noticing that you're losing your hair, it's time to do something about it. For a limited time, you can go to keeps.com/Regis or click that link down there in the description to get 50% off your first order. Okay, moving on here to Wicked Shipment. This one's a little interesting compared to Lost in the Jungle. Nunguro card that's very good in Odd Paladin in particular, just getting a lot of Silverhand recruits down, getting 2 bodies for 1 mana. That's been a recipe for success. Interestingly, Wicked Shipment does the same thing. You get 2 bodies, and they are synergistic in a way. Like, Silverhand recruits have very specific synergies that might offer more upsides, but there are plenty of demon upsides available in Warlock as well. So I'd say Silverhand recruits are a bigger bonus in some cases, but also demand a little bit more specific follow-up. The imps here for Wicked Shipment, similar enough for my sake, but Wicked Shipment, of course, has this tradable upgrade and upside that Lost in the Jungle doesn't. So if you don't need 2 1/1 bodies, trade this in, get a better card. That's great when you get into the mid to the late game and these minions just don't keep up. And then also, of course, when you get it back, it's suddenly way more than 2 1/1 imps. It's going to be 4 1/1 imps, which is a much bigger impact for 1 mana. So much like Cutlass, this takes the same base effect and adds these just ridiculous tradable upsides. And tradable itself is just so good, being able to send a card back and get something in replacement, especially on low cost cards like these. Tradable is just amazing. So I think this just takes it to the totally next level for Lost in the Jungle. Despite any Silverhand recruit upsides, Wicked Shipment is just absurd comparatively, and yet again, not an OP card. Actually, maybe a weak card. We haven't even really seen this one much at all. So it's going to demand quite a bit to make Wicked Shipment look good in modern day Hearthstone, and it's just way better than a card that used to be nuts. Moving on here, we got Druid of the Reef versus Dire Mole, and Dire Mole's a card that actually got played a lot, believe it or not. You don't expect vanilla cards like this to see a ton of play, but back in the Tempo Keleseth era, where you just wanted like good curve minions and stats to build off of, Dire Mole, it turns out, was a really good 1 mana option for that environment. Just getting a 1/3 down was significant back in the day, and in some ways still can be. And Druid of the Reef, of course, can be a 1/3 beast, but he's also got Taunt, which can, of course, be way more disruptive. It has some extra synergy potential in Druid specifically. And, having Taunt's really nice in the mid to late game. Could be that little disruptor that denies trades or creates friction for your opponent. On top of that, Druid of the Reef can also be a 3/1 shark with Rush, which can be important if you need to get some threatening thing out of the way. Or if your opponent just doesn't have a good ping, just drop that 3 attack. Can be a way more aggressive stance to help you, swarm down your opponent with lots of damage. Now, of course, you got to be fair here. Druid of the Reef is a class card, and as we've talked about, class cards tend to get a little bonus over neutral cards, so it's not absurd to see a class card that is stronger than a neutral card. But I think what's interesting here is just how much stronger it is. This goes far beyond any sort of normal class bonus you'd expect, because this card just has way more flexibility, far more just direct upside on its effects. And on top of that, Dire Mole was a good card. It's a card that got played a lot. So Druid of the Reef going to the next level is, I think, rather noteworthy. Next up here is Righteous Defense versus Subdue for Paladin. We got ourselves an Uldum card, not actually that old in the scheme of things. This is a little bit more modern era Hearthstone. 2 mana, set him in his attack and health to 1. For Righteous Defense, you go up a mana, but you get this enormous upside that I think is worth far more than a single mana point, because you get this crazy hand buff that gives stats lost to a minion in hand. So same, fairly efficient removal type card. It doesn't actually remove, but functionally removes, but then you might get 5/5, you might get 8/8 in stats back in hand on, some awesome Divine Shield minion or something. So for only 1 mana, you might get 5/5 in stats, 8/8 in stats. That is very efficient for 1 extra mana over Subdue. And with the way cards like this work, sometimes the 1 extra mana is really not all that punishing. You might be floating mana anyway. You're just happy to deny your opponent's big threat for only 3 mana. So on top of that, this has a holy tag where Subdue doesn't. I would think it would, because the guy's got a bunch of holy light going on. For some reason or another, it's not a holy spell, but that's another small upside here for Righteous Defense as well. So just I think a far stronger evolution of this card for only 1 mana is a great upside you're willing to take. So then finally here we've got Multicaster and Gnomish Inventor. Weirdly, some may not remember this. Gnomish Inventor used to get played some. You'd toss it in because you just needed card draw. There wasn't that much available back in the day. I mean, she is incredibly low statted. She's just drawing you a card. And now we've got Multicaster coming along at the same cost. Better stats as a 3/4. Still not great, but better. Pirate tag, but also drawing you multiple cards based on how many spell schools you've cast throughout a game, which, I think it'd be very hard not to play this with at least 1 spell school cast, assuming you run it in a deck that has spells, obviously, which most people would be, clearly. So it's almost impossible to make it worse than Gnomish Inventor, but then not hard at all to make it notably better. Doubling the card draw, tripling, and beyond is quite viable with Multicaster. And we're actually seeing Multicaster get a little bit of play in some Shaman lists and stuff. Even some Mage lists, I think I've seen it as well, where it's drawing 3 cards very often for 4 mana, which, when attached to a body, is very efficient and clearly takes things to another level compared to the old days here of Gnomish Inventor. So these are pretty comparable 1-to-1, but Multicaster just does 10 things way, way better and triples the effect, essentially, of Gnomish Inventor, which is pretty exciting. I guess it's not, exactly 1-to-1 because there's some conditionality on Multicaster, but for all intents and purposes, it's a much stronger card with far higher potential. And that said, I think that wraps it up for the murdered cards of Stormwind. So what do you think? Are these good changes, bad changes? Is this fine for the game to evolve? Is this just way too much power creep? Are you scared of the power levels of Hearthstone? Curious to hear all those thoughts. I think there's good arguments in both ways, essentially. to be ever the neutral opinion here. It's somewhat concerning when the game keeps getting crazier and crazier over time. I don't think any of these cards, stand out as being too powerful. A lot of people thought Mr. Smite was in that realm. I don't think that's quite true. But they all do showcase, how far the game has gone. And I wouldn't mind a power reset to pull things back, because it sometimes feels like a different game, even if it's, internally consistent within a rotation where it's not like any of this matters as long as it's playing against its peers. Long term, it still makes old cards feel less valuable. And it can change the speed and pace of Hearthstone that we all know and love. So I wouldn't mind pulling these back a little bit, even if they're fine today. Overall, it's still a concerning trend to see just how powerful cards have gotten. That said, look forward to your thoughts. Thanks again to our sponsor for this video, Keeps. And until next time, game on.